Hello everyone. Welcome to today's story. Diep left because she doubted James, leaving him hopeless and unsure of what to hold on to. Will they be able to find each other again? Stay with us until the end to find out. It was late at night. The room was dim, lit only by the pale glow of a desk lamp, casting tired shadows across James's face. He looked worn, his beard unkempt, eyes sunken and bloodshot from sleepless nights. Once again, he picked up his phone. His trembling finger dialed Comrade Than. The dial tone echoed, cold, lifeless, like a heartbeat lost in darkness. "Hello, Comrade Than. If there's any new information about Diep, please let me know." His voice was cracked, dry, as if each word scratched its way up from a broken heart. But the only response was silence, long, unforgiving, suffocating. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. His gaze wandered upward to the ceiling fan turning slowly above, its weak light flickering across the walls. Each rotation pulled him deeper into thought. Where was she? Was she afraid? Was she being held against her will? By John's people or someone else? James clenched his fists. Since Diep disappeared, he hadn't been the same. 4 days, not a message, not a call, not a single clue. Each day stretched endlessly, every minute feeding the anxiety gnawing at his chest. He'd gone everywhere, asked everyone, but nothing. Just silence. Deafening silence. In that quiet room, filled with the soft hum of the fan and the heavy rhythm of his breathing, James sat still. His hope was flickering, small, faint, but still burning. And so he waited, for a signal, for a sound, for anything that might lead him back to her. He had nothing left, only a name, a memory, and a pain that refused to leave. Morning sunlight slipped gently through the narrow gap in the curtains, casting a faint glow over the somber room. James's mother sat at the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were sunken from worry, her shoulders tense with unspoken fear. She looked at her son, voice trembling. "You haven't eaten anything. I'm really worried. If you keep going like this, you'll get sick." James sat across from her, his eyes downcast. "I just don't feel hungry. I'm fine, Mom. Just a little tired." He tried to smile, but it faded before reaching his eyes. His body was present, but his spirit was lost somewhere far away. His mother sighed quietly, turning away so he wouldn't see her wipe her eyes. But James noticed. He reached out, gently taking her hand. His fingers were cold, trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have protected her. I let this happen." She turned back toward him, eyes glistening. "I don't blame you," she said softly, "but you can't fall apart now. You have to keep living, keep searching. As long as you're still breathing, there's still a chance. For her, for you, for us." They sat in silence, hand in hand, as the wind brushed gently against the window. The moment was small, quiet, but heavy with emotion. A mother and son bound not just by blood, but by shared sorrow and unwavering love. Even in that stillness, hope remained, fragile, flickering like a candle in the wind, but not yet extinguished. The meeting room inside the factory felt oppressively heavy, as though even the furniture bore the exhaustion of recent days. James sat silently at the head of the long table. A folder opened before him, though his eyes were unfocused and vacant. Paperwork, statistics, production numbers, none of it mattered right now. A colleague broke the silence cautiously. "There's been heavy rain this morning. I let the workers take the day off. Import shipments are delayed, and the wood supply has become unpredictable. Export orders are piling up too. James nodded, his fingers lightly tapping the table. He heard the words, but they echoed like distant noise. His thoughts drifted endlessly to one place, to where Diep should be, but wasn't. If you prefer, the colleague continued gently, I can handle operations in the meantime. Just give me the scope and I'll manage. James's voice came low and firm, though stripped of warmth. All minor decisions, wood, exports, machines, coordinate them with Tuan. Only call me for issues you absolutely can't resolve. It sounded less like delegation and more like letting go of something he used to care deeply about. After a long pause, the colleague added, And Diep, have you heard anything? James looked up. His face was drawn, his gaze distant. I've searched everywhere, still nothing. Standing slowly, James reached into his bag and removed a stack of blank papers. Print missing person flyers. Send them to all 25 workshops and every partner. No one questioned it. They saw it in his eyes. This wasn't about duty. It was desperation, and time was running out. The afternoon sky was overcast, weighed down by thick clouds, and the dirt road had turned slick with mud after a long morning rain. James and Comrade Duke were on their way back to the factory when they spotted something by the roadside. A woman, collapsed, her body limp against the wet grass. Beside her, a child, small and thin, clung to her side without a sound. James pulled the vehicle to a halt. He jumped out and rushed over. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" He crouched, placing a hand on her back as she tried to lift her head. I feel dizzy," she murmured. "My house, it's nearby." James and Duke helped them into the car without hesitation. They followed the woman's directions to a small, weathered home at the bend of a narrow path. The air inside was damp and cold, the walls lined with peeling paint. The child coughed, a dry, shallow sound. The mother sat with her back to the wall, legs folded, breathing heavily. James looked at Duke. "Buy some noodles, milk, anything for the child. Hurry." Later that evening, the two sat at a rickety kitchen table, eating quietly. "Thank you," the woman whispered, not meeting his eyes. "You're very kind." James didn't speak. He stared out the doorway. Something in this woman reminded him of Diep, exhausted, fading, almost forgotten by the world. He stood, fingers resting on the rough frame of the door. "She's still out there," he said under his breath. "Somewhere, cold, scared, waiting for someone, anyone, to find her." The evening was quiet. Streetlights cast a dim yellow hue across the narrow alley where James stood waiting, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning every figure that passed. A middle-aged woman approached, her steps confident but cautious. "You must be James. I'm Huyen. You're looking for someone?" He nodded slowly, his voice low and worn. "Yes, her name is Diep. She's been missing for several days. I heard you know this area well." Huyen tilted her head slightly, eyeing him with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. "I do, but things like this, they're not easy. We need money to move people, to ask questions." James didn't hesitate. "I can give you 20 million up front. If you find her, I'll add another 10. She glanced quickly at the two men behind her, then looked back at James. "All right, but listen, money doesn't guarantee success. If you don't send it now, we can't promise anything." Without a word, James transferred the money. "I don't care what it takes," he said. As long as there's a chance, I'll pay the price. He knew what this was, a gamble, not just with money, but with the last thread of hope he had. To them, Diep was just a name, a transaction, but to him, she was everything. As the group walked off into the night, James remained, alone beneath the flickering light. His phone stayed in his hand, unmoving, and in his heart, one desperate thought repeated itself. Just one trace, just one clue. I won't stop until I find her. Evening had fallen, and the sky was painted in dull strokes of gray and orange. James returned to the old house where he and Diep once lived, a place now swallowed by silence. The front yard stood still, abandoned, with only the soft rustling of wind through the gored trellis overhead. Once lush and green, the vines were now wilted, yellow, their brittle stems clinging to life. Leaves dangled like faded memories, barely holding on. He walked slowly across the uneven stones leading to the porch. Each creak from the wooden steps sounded louder than it should have, as if the house itself remembered. At the foot of the trellis, he sat at a small wooden table, weathered and stained by time. This was where she used to sit, laughing, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, her eyes warm and alive. James reached out, brushing his fingers across the tabletop. Cold, empty. The silence around him deepened as memories returned. Her laughter in the morning, the sound of her footsteps rushing out in the rain, the way she squeezed his hand when words failed. All gone now. Looking up at the shriveled vines, he whispered, I should have listened to my father. We were too different. He saw it. I didn't. His voice caught. If I hadn't been so proud, maybe she'd still be here. His breath grew unsteady. No tears came, but the weight was crushing. He stood, walked to the edge of the yard. You sat here once, he said. Now there's only wind. The gored trellis, dying and silent, bore witness to a man drowning in memory. Everything once full of life had withered, leaving behind only space, silence, and sorrow. Night had fully settled, draping the city in a hushed stillness. But James hadn't gone home. Instead, he remained in his office. Lights dimmed, silence pressing in. His phone screen flickered occasionally, glowing faintly in the dark. No messages, no calls, only absence. He sat motionless, fingers resting on a stack of freshly printed flyers. The ink was still faintly warm. Across the top, the words stared back at him. Missing person, name Diep. Her name in bold, surrounded by empty space. He picked up the phone and called Ms. Tuan. Please help distribute these flyers to all 25 workshops and every partner we work with. As quickly as possible, he said. His voice didn't crack, but his breath did, betraying the storm beneath. It wasn't hope that drove him now. It was the unwillingness to let go. If even one person sees her, if someone recognizes her, he murmured, more to himself than anyone, like a prayer cast into the void. He returned to his desk and began arranging the flyers into folders, each movement slow and precise, like handling fragile memories. Outside, the world moved on. Streetlights flickered against the windows. A breeze passed through empty streets. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, a car passed. But here, inside, James stayed anchored, between what once was and what still might be. He didn't cry. He didn't collapse. He worked. And when the final folder was closed, he paused, hand resting over the cover, and made a vow, not aloud, but within every beat of his heart. If you're still out there, I want you to know I'm still searching. I haven't given up, and I won't.
Diệp bất ngờ biến mất không dấu vết, để lại James và một CEO chìm trong tuyệt vọng, dằn vặt. Anh liên tục tìm kiếm, gọi điện, internet, liên hệ nhiều nguồn, nhưng tất cả đều im lặng. Mẹ anh lo lắng, khuyên anh giữ sức khỏe, còn James dằn vặt vì nghĩ mình đã không bảo vệ được tình yêu. Trong hành trình tìm kiếm, James gặp nhiều người, thậm chí trả tiền cho những kẻ địa phương chỉ để mong có chút manh mối. Anh trở về ngôi nhà cũ, nơi từng có kỷ niệm đẹp với Diệp, hứa sẽ không bỏ cuộc. Dù hy vọng mong manh, James vẫn tiếp tục, vì với anh Diệp là tất cả.